Thank you, everybody, for coming. And last week, we began a new course of our study, of our discussion. And since we're in the time between Passover and Shavuot, and what do we read between Passover and Shavuot? What do we think about? We think about the fact that the Israelites left Egypt and crossed the sea, but then they had to get to Mount Sinai. And there was a whole journey to get to Mount Sinai. It wasn't just they stepped out of the sea and there they were and they, hallelujah, let's get the Torah. But a lot happened and they had to go through a lot within themselves. And this is part of the reason we count the Omer during this period. And it was a whole and very interesting psychological and spiritual journey that they had to undergo to become ready for revelation. And so last time we looked at the buildup to the crossing of the Red Sea, and we really went into depth. We read all the narrative. This class until Shavuot is going to be all about narrative and reading stories from the Torah and the commentaries. And so last time we really went into depth. We examined, what happened? Because at the beginning of all of it, God led them the long road out of Egypt. And then suddenly God took them into a different road and led them on purpose to the Red Sea. And God on purpose led them to a place where the Egyptians would say, oh, they're stuck in the wilderness. Let's pursue them. So God wanted the Egyptians to pursue them. And we talked about, well, why would God set that up? Why would God just let them leave? Why did God want them to experience the very frightful moment of seeing the Egyptians come up? And why did God allow that to happen? And what was God teaching them? What was God teaching the Egyptians? And we talked about how it was all one big test, right? What are they going to do, right? They arrived, and even Moses had a test, right? They're angry at Moses. They tell Moses, why did you bring us here? Was it for want of graves? And we discussed, can we understand their complaining, or was it something that we judge them for? Moses clearly wasn't too happy because he says, Sheket, be quiet, don't complain to me. But God says to Moses, don't, why are you praying to me? Just go ahead, open the sea. So God clearly had some feeling of understanding for the Jewish people. God wanted them to go through this. So today we're going to actually be reading the crossing of the sea itself. I'm really talking about what this moment meant to them. What was this moment about? Why was it so important? Well, what happened? Anybody have any thoughts they wanted to share from last time? Any enduring thoughts or questions? Okay.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to add something.
Sure.
I thought a lot about my question last week about why the Israelites were not, why they were so afraid to leave. And I compared them to some contemporary examples. And I realized over the week, because I've been thinking about this a lot, is that the reason the contemporary examples strove so hard for freedom was because they had an example. They had an idea that had been implanted from this story, right? This is the original liberation story, right? And so everything that's come after that has used this story as their inspiration. And that's why, in my opinion, subsequent liberation movements have been able to resist. But these Israelites, they had no such example. This is the very first time that in history, it seems, right, that a people has been mass liberated on this scale. And it is unfair of us in the 21st century to be putting that expectation that they would embrace liberation. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's correct. And I just wanted to put that out there. These people had no example. It is a complete leap of faith for them to walk out of Goshen and follow this man, Moses. It's just a complete leap of faith. So
thank you.
Put that out there.
Thank you for adding that. And they did leave, right? They left Egypt. they just got really scared when they saw Egypt running after them, right? They were okay leaving Egypt, but then when they saw all the chariots and no way forward, and where was God, they suddenly got really worried in that moment. So they had some faith to leave Egypt, but yeah, it was a very different world they lived in. There was no, there was no freedom, wasn't in the air. There was no thought that this was possible.
Isn't that where faith comes in?
Yeah, it's a test of faith, right? Did they have faith that the God was going to come and save them? It's easy to have faith. It's easier to have faith when the road is open before you, but when the road is completely blocked, it's sometimes that faith is hard to come by. Okay. David, it looked like you were about to say something, no?
No. I was just thinking that Nancy's analysis of that was very acute, very astute.
David, I channeled you this week because it occurred to me, in a way, it's like the allegory of the cave, right? Where you're stuck inside and you're afraid to go out of the cave because you don't know what's out there. And so you just stay in the cave because it's safe.
That's exactly how we spoke about this last week. The Baal Shem Tov says they were an exile of consciousness. It was like being inside a cave, right? Literally, Mitzrayim is the narrow places. So they were stuck in those narrow places. And when that's everything you know, it's very hard to leave it, right? When all you know is a cave, you don't want to leave the cave because the cave is familiar, and suddenly you have to experience new things. And we all have that experience, right? That's a universal experience. We all
That's
have
what's happening to the people in Maripol stuck in that building in the tunnels. They're probably afraid to go outside to see what's out there waiting for them.
Well, and maybe the Russians were afraid of going out of their cave of and that's why they attacked, because they wanted to.
Yeah.
Because two things happened, right? They had to leave Egypt, but there was also Pharaoh who was coming after them. Okay, so let's begin. God spoke to Moses and said, "I'm going to take care of this. Don't worry." Now we have the beginning of all the action of the crossing of the sea. So we're in verse 19. Alan, do you mind reading, please?
The messenger of God, who had been going ahead of the Israelite army, now moved and followed behind them. And the pillar of cloud shifted from in front of them and took up a place behind them. And it came between the army of the Egyptians and the army of Israel. Thus there was the cloud with the darkness, and it cast a spell upon the night, so that the one could not come near the other all through the night.
Okay, let's just stop for a second, because this is a part of what happened. What's this thing of this cloud that goes behind and before and?
Rabbi, I had a question. I thought that cloud was actually God himself or herself.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's saying here it's a messenger. It was, one of his messengers.
Mm-hmm.
So, because
when
they talk about the pillar, of the cloud before, at least the way I understood it was that it was God, who was doing that.
It sounds to me like we're talking also about another level of being, which we're talking about a spiritual journey. So in the beginning, the cloud or the light or the spiritual center is in front of you, and then somehow the cloud shifts, so the spiritual center becomes behind you. And that might be an experience that lots of people have had over time. Otherwise, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me, unless you talk about it as a spiritual journey in addition to some physical thing that might have happened.
So what's the message to the children of Israel if this is part of their journey of seeing this cloud suddenly follow them? If imagine you're there, the the Egyptians are coming. Moses has said to you, Israel, God is going to fight on your behalf, and suddenly you see the cloud shift. I mean, what does it signal to you? God is. Let's see what Rashi says about that.
I think that, God's got your back
Yeah.
at that point.
Totally. And also there's no going back.
Mm.
Say again. Say
I
again,
said
Judy.
There's no going back.
There's no going back. Beautiful.
Well,
Beautiful.
the front and the back issues are very important, and they've come up in other times too. Like, for example, when Moses first sees the burning bush, he has to turn back to somehow get another view of it, but this time from behind. So the front and the back, and these are sort of spiritual experiences, are important in this, I think.
So let's see what Rashi says. Rashi gives a midrashic view. Judy, do you mind reading for us?
I may be able to. A parable, it may be compared to one who is proceeding on a journey, his son walking in front of him. Thanks. If now brigands come to capture him, the son, he takes him away in front of him and places him behind himself. If a wolf then comes behind him, he places him again in front. If brigands come in front of him and wolves behind him, he places it on his arm and fights against them. Thus did God do for Israel, as it says, I led Ephraim, he took them upon his arms.
It's pretty sweet, right? There's a very sweet image there of protection, it's like you're walking and your parent is making sure that everything, makes me think of when I'm with my kids and suddenly you get to the crossing of the street, give me your hand, I'm going to need to protect you because you can't just run around if there's a street, there's a tremendous sense of protection, maybe seeing that happen, right? Of being knowing that you're watched over. Because when the plagues were happening, it was a little bit remote, right? Either it was happening to all of Egypt or it was happening to the Egyptians. But this is something really very personal, something really, a sense of real closeness, of intimacy.
Was it a sense of protection, or could it have been a sense of nudging or pushing?
Yes.
It's like you don't want to move.
Get going.
No.
Across the street already, right? Well, when you're a parent, you're always in nudging mode and you're always in protection mode at the same time, right? Time to get out the door, time to cross the street.
Rabbi, in verse 20, before we move on, in verse 20, where in English it says, the army of the Egyptians and the army of Israel. Is that what it says in the Hebrew?
It says the camp. It really says it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. I'm not sure why they translated it here as
Okay. Because I think I also got stuck last week. I think it was in this class last week where it kind of referred to an army, and I keep thinking, well, there may have been 600,000 adult males, but they just came out of 400 years of slavery. I wouldn't think of them as an army. Pharaoh's forces, sure, but wouldn't have thought of the Israelites as being an army. But that's kind of my thing.
Well, we read what Ibn Ezra said last week, which was, well, you would have thought something that I maybe had never thought of, but you would have thought that they would have fought back. I mean, there's 600 chariots and some Egyptians, and there was 600,000 Israeli, men. Why didn't they just, run up and do what they could to fight? And Ibn Ezra says, well, they didn't have that capacity. They weren't fighters. They just, it wasn't in there. And also, I mean, chariots can plow into you. I mean, that's getting into details, but it's still speaking to the psyche of the Israelites. Here you're the people who are running after you. And I even thought, Lahavdil, a different comparison. It was Yom HaShoah last week when we studied, but imagine if you're survive the Shoah, the Holocaust, and you're in the DP camp and you think it's all over, and then suddenly you see, tanks and tanks of SS commanders coming your way, you would be in total fright psychologically. You would be you couldn't believe they're coming back after you. That would just be your nightmare coming alive, right? It would be, you wouldn't think anything except, how could this be happening? And that's, the Egyptians had that psychological hold on the Israelites. Okay.
May I ask a question and also on verse 20? I think Alan has, I believe he may have the altar translation with the camp and the army, but there's a verb in there, and the JPS in the footnote, I guess you don't see it on the screen here, points out that you can take that verb and they take it as, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, Yod Resh Resh, and they cast a spell or something like that. But you can take it as,
which verse are you, sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's in verse 20, where it says Vayaer. So if you take that as, I guess, Alter does, and it's what the footnote suggests others take it as just the verb to make to give light,
illuminate.
To illuminate, right? Then you could have a more sort of naturalistic picture. There they are, and there's the light. It lights up the night.
That's what Alter, Phil.
Yes,
that's what Alter says.
Right. That's why I mentioned, but the verb is I guess ambiguous as how you you figure the root of the verb. Is that what he's saying? Is that right?
Honestly, I hadn't even properly read a translation, because Yair to me is so clearly to light up.
Yeah.
Where cast a spell comes from with that. All right, from Resh Resh.
Yeah.
It's interesting. The Yair makes more sense, especially preceding night, that they would light up the night, and that's creates a powerful visual too.
Right. Yes. Thank you.
So here we have the moment. Alan, please continue.
Then Moses held out his arm over the sea, and Adonai drove back the sea with a strong east wind all that night, and turned the sea into dry ground. The waters were split, and the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left.
Let's stop there. Maybe
I have a question
what is
about
this?
that. I have a question
Go
about
ahead.
that. I have some friends that live in Seattle, and we would go to their house. They live right on the water. Sometimes you couldn't go down to the shoreline because of tide. But sometimes it's high tide and sometimes it's low tide. And at certain tide, there wouldn't be any water there.
Right.
Just a thought.
No, there's, so a lot of this has been throughout, especially modern history. People are trying to figure out, how could this have happened naturally, right?
Right.
Big question. How could it happen naturally? And so I just, people have been talking about that. And one of the reasons that people say, well, maybe it was the Sea of Reeds instead of the Red Sea, right? The word Yam Suf means Sea of Reeds. The Red Sea is a sea, and to cross it, it's thousands of feet deep. So if you clear the water, and then how do you have to go all the way down those thousands of feet and then cross a lost area, and the bottom of an actual sea is going to be mud. You're not going to, there's nothing solid at the bottom, probably. And so people say it's probably the Sea of Reeds, which is maybe a kind of lake that's at the edge of Egypt, and that a wind could cause the waters to go up. And but you're trying to explain something which is presented completely supernaturally in a rational way, or a scientific way as we understand it. But there was a famous book in the 70s, I can't remember what his name was, where he tried to explain all the plagues with, maybe right at that moment there was a meteor, and that was the plague of the hail, fiery hail, right? And so he tried to look up when when was there a really noticeable meteorite shower that came upon the earth, and locusts and all these things. I mean, even the commentators have questions about this, and the rational ones like Maimonides, well, he says this was kind of like worked into the plan for the world. So before God even created the world, God said, well, at this moment, on this day, at this time, this is going to happen. So the laws of nature weren't broken. For me, that doesn't work, but it's an interesting idea.
Well, it depends how you take it. This probably looks to me like what we might call a miracle. And I think for the modern sensibilities, it's very difficult to understand an abruption of nature totally in the form of a miracle. Very difficult to understand that. And in fact, it can't really be understood, as you point out. So are we going to take this as a miracle or some sort of work of nature that's just strange?
And
Well, there's a note that I see here on the internet, that this guy found that an east wind at 63 miles an hour, sustained for 12 hours, would clear a mud flat path across the junction up to 2.5 miles long and some 3 miles wide.
Wonderful.
Anyone wanting to cross would have had about 4 hours to do it, according to the modeling results. So I don't know.
Very nice. Well, God used the wind, right, in the story. So it was that's some good piece of research, an impressive piece of research. So,
You know what it used to be as a kid, when I would study this stuff, I would just take it on faith, okay? Now we've gotten into a place where everybody has to examine every single thing and try to find something wrong with it, rather than just accepting it. I don't see anything wrong with just accepting it. However it happened, whether it's a miracle, whether it's tide, whether it was God, whatever.
No, and I think it is, what the most important part is that what happened to the Israelites. What did it do for them? Here they were. If they were waiting at the sea, they were in panic, and the Egyptians were coming up behind them, and God led them to this test, and they passed it. They walked into the sea, and so what's this moment like for them? I mean,
Well, it's like the parable, except that this time it was God who put his hand in front and in back and saved them.
So when at the second Seder this year, we had a big screen and we put up this moment of the crossing of the sea from the Ten Commandments movie, and so we saw it was great. Everybody was crossing and everybody started clapping because it was such a great moment. So it was joy, right? It must have been, what was that experience like? It must have been so joyful and incredible to see that happening, right? This morning I was praying as part of our minyan, the Hallel, and sometimes Hallel is a very joyful prayer. It's a prayer of thanksgiving. Praise God, for God is good. And sometimes you feel it, and sometimes you don't. And Yom Ha'atzmaut for me is one of those days where I feel the power of that prayer. Praise God, God is good. The miracle of Israel. And here we have, this is, you want to break out in song because you're in gratitude. This is the moment to do it. It's an incredible deliverance. And there are, so let's read the Midrash on this, just one short Midrash on this. Norma, do you mind reading the one line from the Mechilta?
A handmaid saw at the sea splitting what Ezekiel the prophet wasn't even able to see.
So Ezekiel, right? Ezekiel was the prophet who had the greatest visions of all time, right? The most wild visions, the most vivid visions. And so what is it saying when it says a handmaid saw even what Ezekiel didn't see?
The most common person, or not common, ordinary human being. could see what even the great prophet didn't see or
This-
foresee.
just saw something incredible, right? Just the experience of crossing the sea. They just entered into a totally different world, right? There's all these midrashim about it, which I didn't put in there, but they say it was like walking through the sea. It was like you walked up and you put your hand in the water, and anything your heart desired, you could pull out. Any fruit. If you thought of an apple, there was an apple. If you thought of a banana, there was a banana. Just this incredible wonder, right? Just something shifted, right? When they walked into the sea, they just entered into something completely different.
You know,
Well, those were the early days too, when our senses hadn't yet completely congealed the way they are now. Okay, so we take our sensations for granted. We take them as being real. We take them as being concrete. In those days, I think there was more of a blur between your self-experience and your senses. So it's possible that the handmaid, who is uneducated and is in touch with the blur around her, and it hasn't been as firmed up. I mean, for example, after the Enlightenment, it really gets firmed up when we get into empiricism, when we get into everything being derived from the senses. So this is a real early time. And in fact, it's a time when miracles can occur because people's sensations are not disjoint from their subjectivity. So the subject and object of things are not that clearly distinguished. I mean, that's sort of a philosophic way to take that.
That could be also putting a judgment on it, saying that we're more mature in some ways,
now
intellectually, but it could just mean that we're more concrete, right? It could mean that
sure. Well, we're closer to the so-called Garden of Eden. You know, the Garden of Eden experience is the senses and the subjectivity are very, very close together. And then what happens is we concretize the senses through the experience of the Garden of Eden. And over time, over history, the senses become more and more concrete. So everything outside of us seems unbelievably real. Everything inside of us seems sort of flaky. But in those days, the two were very close to each other.
Or maybe it's a seesaw, right? You go through periods where everything becomes very concrete, and they become too concrete. So kind of the inner soul of human beings says, I need to open up and bring back more of the.
Well, in fact, that happens in the 19th century, for example. After a huge wave of materialism, you had waves of spiritualism that inhabited Europe. I mean, with all kinds of stuff, with ghosts coming back, some good stuff, ghosts, angels, all those kinds of critters that are sort of in between the senses and the subjectivity.
So, I mean, it's interesting because in some ways, this is part of my own journey to become a rabbi. But before I decided to become a rabbi when I was in Nepal, doing social justice work and working for an organization, and I was living in a society which was a lot more primitive in some ways, much more less developed and less concrete. But I also saw the power of their religious and spiritual lives, which was they didn't struggle with faith; they just had faith, and it was so alive. They went to one of their temples, and they had experiences all the time, it was so alive for them. And so many of I was working with Israeli volunteers, and so many of the volunteers would also have these experiences. They'd go, and this whole perception changed because they were in an environment where that was open. There was no, we've set such through the Enlightenment, we've set such a line between this is spiritual and this is physical, and spiritual is of the imaginative and is of the not real, and the concrete is of the real. And if you want the spiritual is in the realm of poetry, in the realm of music, but it's not in the realm of what's real, what's truth. But in those societies, there's no such fine line between the two. And I felt it to be something that we'd maybe gone too far in Judaism into, believing in that line between the two, and that we need to ease up a little bit on that line, and bring back a little bit a sense of that back and forth of what is real and what is truth, to make our religious lives more alive, and to make our religious our prayer lives, all that part of being Jewish. So that,
well, and the whole notion of meditation or contemplation does that, because what it does is it creates a focus on the subjective, on your subjective life. And by focusing on your subjective life, it makes it almost as real, or at times as real, as your objective life, as the life of your senses. So your interest in meditation flows out of that, because you sort of have a good feel for that.
I do, but I'll even take it further, and I'll say, you show me that, everything is subjective on one hand, right? Physics showed us that too. Everything is based on, the very particles in our bodies are actually floating between our bodies and the chairs that we're sitting on at this very moment. So everything, our reality is only subjective because of certain physical laws. But there's a lot more going on the surface. Anyway, we don't have to go too much more into that. But I think this is what's interesting to talk about in this moment is that this is a moment where all those there's no boundary, right? For them, there's no boundary. What does it mean for them that they're experiencing this at the end of slavery, at the end of those 400 years? What's it doing to them? What is God trying to show them?
Well, it's a blast for them. I mean, it's a huge opening in the world for them. It's a complete change of structure for them.
Mm-hmm. What are you thinking if you're an Israelite and you're in that moment of complete fear, and you walk into the sea, and suddenly you're experiencing things that you'd never experienced, what Ezekiel didn't experience, and you're walking through the waters? What does that blast do to you?
As they say in the science fiction movies, it was a rip in the time-space continuum.
Very nice.
Right.
Very nice.
Yeah, it's transformative. Clearly, you're taking a primitive and a primitive people, right, with a primitive way of looking at the world, right, and then you are exposing them to this incredible natural phenomenon, which, okay, if you intellectualize about it and figure out what it is, it's still pretty mind-blowing. And even if you don't have that intellectual outlook, it is terrifying. So you are now in the middle of the Red Sea or Reed Sea or low tide, whatever, and you are terrified, right? You're surrounded by hundreds of people. They can stampede you. You don't know what this cloud of fire and dust is or where it came from, because it is supernatural. You're in the middle of your destruction. You are looking at your destruction in that moment that you are standing in the middle of the sea. You got water up here, you got Egyptians in the back, you got the pillar of fire. I would be crapping my pants at this point. Okay, so they are literally at the bottom of the sea. They are as low as they can go spiritually, physically. And let's not even talk about emotion intellectually, because as Jews, we intellectualize everything. And I think just listening to this conversation, everybody's trying to analyze everything, and they're using their intellect for something that is here. This is the moment that the people are stripped down to their basic faith. Either they go along with it because that's all they can do. They can't rationalize their way out of this. They can't intellectualize their way out of this. The only way out is forward. And the only way forward is to accept what is going on, which
Brendan,
has
there's-
no rational explanation.
No, there's no rational explanation during the moment. But, you know,
No.
it's also natural after the thing is finished to say, hey, what was that?
what
Yeah.
just happened here?
Okay.
Yeah.
But-
Yeah, and you still can't explain it
But it's
after.
true,
No,
we're
You're
not,
not going-
we're intellectualizing. We're doing the opposite. We're trying to de-intellectualize it. and
Well,
make it-
yeah, we're deconstructing the intellect.
But I do think that you're right. I love the image. On each side is water. They can't go behind. They can only go forwards. And there's nothing left except the sudden, right? It's so sudden, the deliverance. You go from complete despair to suddenly the water is opening and you're walking through it and you're plunged into something completely new. I mean, it's a complete deliverance, right? And you're experiencing, you know, you've gone from sorrow, right? The again, Hallel, from the narrow places, you took me to the wide places. Yeah, you know, you took me to the wide places. So there, you know, what's a spiritual experience? You know, it's an expansive, wide place, right? So they're, even though they're terrified, they're worried, but suddenly everything just opens up. And they're walking through, opening up, singing, if you believe our story, right? Singing a song that naturally comes into their lips. And and I think you're right that the fact they say a handmaid is to tell us it wasn't about intellectual achievement. It wasn't about who had, you know, anything from before. This was about faith, but it was also just swept everybody. It was a total gift. It was a total gift everybody received. And it was transformative. Okay, so let's read on a little bit.
Okay.
Okay. Norma, do you mind reading on the Egyptians?
The Egyptians came in pursuit after them into the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and riders. At the morning watch, Adonai looked down upon the Egyptian army from a pillar of fire and cloud and threw the Egyptian army into panic. God locked the wheels of their chariots so that they moved forward with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for Adonai is fighting for them against Egypt." Then Adonai said to Moses, "Hold out your arm over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians and upon their chariots and upon their riders." Moses held out his arm over the sea, and at daybreak, the sea returned to its normal state, and the Egyptians fled at its approach. But Adonai hurled the Egyptians into the sea. The waters turned back and covered the chariots and the riders. Pharaoh's entire army that followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the Israelites had marched through the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Oh. Thus Adonai delivered Israel that day from the Egyptians. Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shore of the sea. And when Israel saw the wondrous power which Adonai had yielded against the Egyptians, the people feared Adonai. They had faith in Adonai and in God's servant Moses. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Powerful stuff, right?
I'm a little confused
Mm-hmm.
Well,
because the way we, I think, normally talk about the story is the Israelites crossed, the Egyptians rode after them. You know, God let the seas or stopped the seas parting, and the seas closed in on the Egyptians. And I think what I just read was Moses raised his arms,
Mm-hmm.
the seas parted, the Egyptians, the Israelites crossed. Moses raised his arms again. The seas closed. God threw the Egyptians into the sea, or the Egyptians fled at the sea's approach, but God hurled the Egyptians into the sea.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an even more deliberate act than just, the Egyptians chased the Israelites and the seas closed because it was time for the seas to close. But God said that wouldn't have been enough. I'm going to take the Egyptians, throw them into the sea, close the water, and or no, the water had already been closed. I call close the water, throw the Egyptians into the sea, and kill them all.
God seems very much an active part of destroying the Egyptians. Not just the waters came back, but God was very much. It's hard to know exactly. I was going to look where Rashi says about the hurling. Did God? Let's see. So here, what this is. So the Rashi interprets the word hurl to mean overthrow. So, or shook out or emptied out, as a person empties out a pot, turning what is on top underneath and what is underneath on top. Thus, they were emptied out of their chariots, and they rose and fell till at last they were broken to pieces in the sea. So it's true. That's not how the movie portrays it necessarily, or how we sometimes think about it. What does that do for you, Alan? Does it make?
I mean, it doesn't. It doesn't change the sense of the story, but it definitely, to me, makes God a much, as you said, a much more active participant. In the story, as I have always thought of it, the Egyptians, in a sense, got caught where they shouldn't have been at a bad time. But in this reading, it really wouldn't have mattered. They could have just been standing on the shore, or they were just on the shore, and God threw them in the sea in a fit of rage or revenge or whatever.
I mean, it's very interesting. We have two different views of God at the same time here, right? And we have the God who's destroying the Egyptians, and then we have this God who's like a protective parent of the Israelites and holding their hand and giving them amazing visions and sweets, and it's all, God at this moment. God to the Jews is very different to God to the Egyptians. It's a different lesson. Who can read for us this midrash? Pesikta de Rav Kahana. Morris, do you mind reading for us?
The fact is, our Haya Bar Abba said that God appeared to them in a guise appropriate to each and every place and time. At the Red Sea, God appeared to them as a mighty man waging their wars. At Sinai, God appeared to them as a teacher, as one who stands upright in awe when teaching Torah. In the days of Daniel, God appeared to them as an elder teaching Torah, for the Torah is at its best when it comes from the mouths of old men. In the days of Solomon, God appeared to them as a young man in keeping with the youthful spirit of Solomon's generation. At Sinai, then, when God said, I am Adonai your God, appropriately, God appeared to them as a teacher teaching Torah.
Thank you. And one could maybe add that at the sea, God appeared to them both as a mighty warrior, but also as a protective parent who gave them, who was, as we read, behind and before them with the cloud, and gave them this experience. What is God trying to teach the Israelites through all of this?
They should have faith in him
Yeah.
or her.
Yeah. Beautiful, right? They need to have faith in God, and God takes them to the moment of test where everything is at its possible worst, and then there's the completely unimaginable deliverance with.
And God changes also. It's not always exactly the same.
Mhm.
Is God changing, or is it our experience of God that changed? Or can we tell the difference?
Well,
So it might be our impression of it as we change.
Yeah, I mean,
Possible,
the notion is God is supposed to be the same, unchanging, not changing. So it seems to me, at least one of the ways to think about this is that the change in God is an appearance, is our impression of it, is somehow an internal projection from ourselves to God. God keeps being the same, but that notion doesn't give God any agency. So you're sort of caught with this thing. If you want God to be the same all the time, then God doesn't have any agency, can't do miracles. So probably both are correct, or neither is correct.
well, that's why you can say, which is, I guess, the Kabbalist way, that God is unchanging, but God can also do absolutely anything. So God can appear as anything. Doesn't mean that God is changing. God is
the
still,
appearance,
it's a mystery. The God can be completely unchanging, but at the same time, we try and bring our rational mind to put into categories, but there's no rational mind to understand.
Right. So the opposites of things can't exist in our mind, but can exist in the deity. So a God, the opposite, things changing or being the same are opposites, right? So God can be both changing and the same, which makes no sense to us. But from a certain higher logical perspective, you can put the two of those together.
And it's at the same time, what is changing? Maybe just nothing's changing, just the outer appearance, or what the Israelites need to experience. And at this moment, they need to experience the absolute power of their God, which gives them complete faith, right? If you see God doing that to the Egyptians, you have total faith. Your faith is, okay, I've got my faith. And then, slowly God is shepherding you and moving you and taking you to taking you to a different place too. Let's go here to Ibn Ezra. Morris, do you mind reading this one too, please?
And they believed in the Lord. They believed that the Lord is truth, unchanging, and ultimate being. Mishnah Torah, Mada 1:3, 4. The truth of his being is incomparable to the truth of any other individual being. He alone is the truth, and no other being possesses a truth similar to his truth. And that Moses is his servant and will do only that which the Lord commands him to do.
That's an interesting way of understanding what they went through, that they understood through that experience that God is truth. And maybe it wasn't so much seeing only the Egyptians, but also the experience that they underwent before. Because before, they were just slaves who were noticing that there's this God who's destroying their slave masters, right? That's one experience. But it's another experience to know that God is truth, whatever what that means. How do you come to know that God is truth?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is to try a contemplation where God is both changing and unchanging simultaneously. Okay, try and think that. And although that might seem impossible to think, it sort of can be thought. And the experience you get is you get an experience of truth. It's the same experience that people get in the Tao Te Ching, where God is the center and splits into two sides. The truth is a unity, but as the truth comes into manifestation, it always comes in with two opposites. So if you can get to the unity in it, you're close to the thing itself.
I think it's very, very, very true and very Zen or Tao. But I think for them, it was much more simpler. They weren't having any intellectual thought of God as changing or unchanging. I think for them, they're just walking and they have an experience. They're having an experience of God as truth. And so God took them to this moment. And maybe before they weren't ready to meet God, right? But here, finally, they're meeting God, right? They saw God do all these things to the Egyptians, but they're still slaves. They're not ready to meet God. But somehow God engineered this whole experience, this whole moment, right? God took them here so that they could meet him or her and have this experience where they're not only seeing the wonders, but experiencing and meeting God. Because right, this is the way our tradition also sees it, that the people got, they became engaged to God at the Red Sea, right? It was like a marriage, and then they got married on Mount Sinai. But you got to at least meet your spouse one time to know what you're getting yourself into, right? So this is where they met God, and it was a big moment.
I think we may be misled a bit by the translation here, that they believed in the Lord, and instead of that they trusted, which you find not just an altar but lots of translations, which because it's really not a focus on abstract contents of propositions, but because once you get into that, then David's earlier point comes into play. You have to worry about whether the law of contradiction applies. And in other words, you have to be a philosopher. You have to be Maimonides, struggling with this. And yes, it doesn't make sense in a way for God to be an agent and make changes in the world. That's a big struggle in the philosopher's mind. But I don't think that's what's happening here. They trust in him and in his, and I'll say his because it's a very masculine story, and in his servant, Moses. And in fact, that's the one bit of Moses, I think it does make its way into the Haggadah, because that's in the Haggadah, there is that reference. We always say he's not in there, but that's in there. And it's about emunah, it's about trusting, rather than about adhering to a set of propositions.
Very, very interesting. And right, emunah, which means belief or trust. Where is it most commonly said? When we say amen, right? Amen. What does amen mean? It means I believe, I trust. And it's not, when you're saying it, it's not an article of faith. And we, as Jews, have never had that. We've never really had, articles of faith. I mean, we have Maimonides has his principles, but they're not they're not the core of our faith. We're people of experience. We're people of history. Things happen to us, and we're witnesses. And this is what Jews have always experienced. Things happen to us, and that's how it affects our spiritual lives. And maybe to end the class, it is Yom Ha'atzmaut, and the great strangeness of our generations is that we experienced the greatest catastrophe the Jews maybe have ever experienced, which is the Holocaust. And we experienced what may be, since this moment, the greatest miracle the Jews have ever experienced, which is the return to the homeland. And we experienced both of those, and we're still trying to understand and place ourselves in the midst of all of it. It may take another 3-4 generations before it all settles down. But we're like the Israelites who just crossed the sea in our generations. We experience these huge experiences as a people like we haven't experienced in 2,000 years, and we're trying to make sense of them. And what does it teach us, and where does it take us? And maybe what's interesting is, well, what happened after they left their Egypt and they crossed the sea? It wasn't the end. They still had to go to the mountain and receive the revelation. They had to continue on and find and get a new path. And so I sometimes think, well, okay, what does it mean that we're back in the land of Israel? What is that miracle about? And maybe we don't know yet, but hopefully we'll find out. And maybe there'll be something we can't even imagine yet that we'll find as a kind of purpose as a people that will take us on for the next 2,000 years. So will take us on for whatever is next. This was an opening moment, but it wasn't the final opening, because the people, a few days later start complaining, "Where's my water? Where's my this?" And real life always comes back after such a moment of joy and transcendence. But then there's always a period of self-transformation, of trying to find unity, which Israel is also struggling with, and trying to find a path forward. So Chag Sameach, everyone.
Very enjoyable.
Yeah.
Rabbi, can I just
Sure, go ahead.
a couple of quick things from Alter?
Please.
Because Phil drove me to open up my copy. And just 2 things that he wrote in footnotes. This isn't even about his translation, but when God moved the fire to the back of the camp from the front, they were going through the Red Sea at night, and the fire, instead of illuminating the way, was in the back. So they were going into the sea in the dark. And it's like a whole different picture of what happened.
Even more faith.
Yeah. And then the other is that the Egyptians were killed in the sea, which is exactly what the Pharaoh commanded the Egyptians do to the Israelite firstborn, to drown them.
Very nice.
And, I'm just thinking, what a masterful storyteller. We just, unfortunately, don't have, I think, enough knowledge, I at least don't have enough knowledge of Hebrew or knowledge of
It's not Hebrew. It's just we're not hearing the whole story at once. If you heard the whole story at once, it's a very clear symbolism. You would take that in.
So I just wanted to kind of open up people's minds a little bit with those 2 things to think about.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Wonderful.
Ellen.
I love that.